The biometric lock hissed open before Imani's knuckles could even graze the wood. It wasn't the sound of a residence welcoming a guest, it was the sound of a trap snapping shut. The air that rushed out of the penthouse was chilled, smelling of expensive sandalwood and the sharp, clinical scent of gun oil. She froze, the thermal delivery bag suddenly feeling like a lead weight in her hands. In the dim, amber light of the foyer, Lee Song-jin stood like a monument to cold violence. His throat was a canvas of black ink that disappeared beneath the collar of a hand-tailored suit, and his eyes, dark, unreadable, and terrifyingly familiar, weren't looking at the delivery receipt. They were locked on the thin, silver scar circling her left wrist. "Run now, or you'll never see the sun again." "You're late, Imani," he purred, the sound vibrating in the narrow space between them. He didn't reach for the package. Instead, his hand, mapped with tattoos of old-world dragons, closed over the doorframe above her head. The movement was slow, deliberate, and utterly dominant, physically erasing her only exit. "I've been waiting for this delivery since the night you ran. 10 years is a long time to keep a man hungry." Imani's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. She instinctively reached for the app on her phone to mark the drop-off, to find some tether to the mundane world, but the screen flickered and died. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, the delivery route hadn't been a glitch. It was a summons. Every turn she'd taken through the city, every light she'd caught, had been orchestrated to bring her exactly to this door. "The app, it was hacked," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. Song-jin stepped into her personal space, the sheer heat of his body clashing with the icy air of the apartment. He reached out, not to touch her skin, but to take the package from her white-knuckled grip, tossing it onto a marble side table without a second glance. "The ledger you stole when you were a child, the one that cost your father his life, contained more than just names, Imani. It contained the sequence to my family's billions. And you have the only copy left in that beautiful, terrified head of yours." He leaned down, his breath ghosting against her ear, his voice dropping to a jagged edge. "My cousins are already floor to floor, searching for the girl who has their inheritance. If you walk out that door, you're a corpse. If you stay, you're mine. Choose quickly, I hear the elevator opening. Step inside before the shadows catch you, or stay to find out what he does to thieves." The ding of the elevator echoed down the hall like a starter's pistol. Imani didn't think, she dove. She lunged for the gap under Song-jin's arm, her sneakers skidding on the polished marble. Freedom was a dozen feet away, the stairwell door, the emergency exit, anything but this tomb of sandalwood and steel. She never even made it to the carpet. Song-jin moved with a fluidity that defied his size. In a blurred motion of charcoal wool and ink, he intercepted her, his hand catching her waist and swinging her back into the foyer. He didn't just stop her, he overwhelmed her, pinning her back against the cold stone wall with the weight of his entire body. The air left her lungs in a sharp gasp. His tattooed hand slammed against the wall beside her head, the sound like a gunshot. "I didn't spend a decade tracking a ghost just to watch you vanish in the hallway," he rasped, his face inches from hers. He reached into her jacket pocket, his fingers grazing her ribs with a proprietary heat that made her skin crawl and burn simultaneously. He withdrew her phone and the cracked leather wallet containing her ID. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed them into a silver bowl on the credenza. "You're going to want those back," she breathed, her pulse thrumming in her throat. "Those belong to a delivery girl named Imani who lived in a basement apartment on 4th Street, Song-jin said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "As of 3 minutes ago, that girl doesn't exist. I've wiped the servers. Your social security number is flagged as deceased. Your lease is terminated. You are legally a shadow." "You can't do that," she hissed, though the ice in her veins told her he already had. "I can do anything to what I own." He stepped back, not to let her go, but to force her deeper into the suite. He gestured toward the far wall of the living area. Imani's breath hitched. It wasn't a wall, it was a floor-to-ceiling digital display, and as she approached, her own face stared back at her. It wasn't one photo. It was hundreds. Imani at her high school graduation. Imani crying at her father's funeral. Imani last Tuesday, laughing with a coworker over a cheap coffee. It was a shrine of her life, documented with the precision of a predator studying its prey. She felt a wave of nausea. Every moment she thought she had been alone, every year she thought she had successfully hidden in the urban sprawl, he had been there. Watching. Waiting for the ledger in her mind to become the only thing standing between him and a coup. The realization was suffocating, her freedom had never been real. She had been living in a cage with invisible bars, and Song-jin had finally decided to turn the key. "Why now?" she whispered, her eyes fixed on a photo of herself sleeping on a bus. "Because my enemies are at the door, and you are the only vault they can't crack." He stepped behind her, his shadow swallowing hers. "And because I'm tired of watching you through a lens." A heavy thud vibrated through the reinforced front door. Someone was outside. Not the police, someone with a battering ram. Song-jin didn't flinch, he simply looked at the heavy steel bolts of the door and then back to her. "They're here for the girl who doesn't exist," he said, handing her a sleek, black ceramic knife. "Tell me where the ledger is, or I let them in." The ceramic knife felt cold and useless in Imani's hand as Song-jin led her deeper into the penthouse, away from the rhythmic thudding at the door. He didn't take her to a cellar, but to a dressing suite that felt like a glass-walled cage. On the central ottoman lay a heap of midnight blue silk, shimmering like oil on water. "Take off the polyester," he commanded, his eyes raking over her salt-stained delivery jacket. "You are no longer a courier. Tonight, you are the interim chairman's guest. My board of directors is staging a coup, and they expect me to show weakness. You are going to be my strength." "I'm not wearing that," Imani spat, clutching her jacket closed. "I'm not playing dress-up for a murderer." Song-jin didn't argue. He stepped into her space, his presence an absolute vacuum that sucked the oxygen from the room. He reached for her zipper. Imani flinched, but he was patient, his movements devoid of haste. "The men outside will skin you alive for the codes in your head. I will merely wrap you in silk. Choose your monster, Imani." He peeled the heavy backpack and jacket from her shoulders, his hands lingering on her collarbone. The intimacy was a weapon, he dressed her with a terrifyingly gentle precision, his tattooed fingers navigating the delicate hooks of the gown. When he pulled the silk tight against her spine, the friction sent a traitorous shiver through her. He wasn't just hiding her identity, he was branding her with his status. He led her to a small dining alcove where a spread of Goryeo delicacies sat untouched. The scent of ginger and seared beef filled the air, but Imani's stomach twisted in a knot of defiance. "Eat," he ordered, sitting across from her. "I'd rather starve than take anything from you. How do I know it's not drugged?" Song-jin stared at her, his unreadable eyes darkening. Without a word, he picked up her chopsticks. He took a piece of the braised short rib from her plate, chewed, and swallowed. Then he took a sip from her water glass. He waited, the silence stretching until the only sound was the hum of the city below. Only after several minutes passed did he pick up his own fork. "I am the only person on this continent who needs you alive," he said softly. "I provide, Imani. That is the burden of the chairman. If you don't eat, I don't eat. We can both wither away while my cousins burn the city down to find us." The power shift was subtle but suffocating. He wasn't just her captor, he was positioning himself as her sole provider, her only shield. As she finally took a trembling bite, the realization sank in, he was making her dependent on the very hand that had shattered her life. A notification chimed on his wrist, a red light pulsing against his skin. His jaw tightened. "The board has called an emergency vote. They think I've lost the ledger. They think I've lost control." He stood, reaching across the table to wipe a stray drop of water from her lip, his touch lingering too long to be accidental. "We're going to the boardroom. If you drop the mask for even a second, we both die before the elevator hits the lobby." The transition from the dining alcove to the floor-to-ceiling windows of the living area was a walk through a minefield of unspoken threats. The city lights of Seoul stretched out below them like a carpet of fallen stars, indifferent to the war brewing in the heights. Imani felt the weight of the silk gown pulling at her skin, a constant reminder of the man walking a half-step behind her. "Keep your head up," Song-jin commanded, his voice a low vibration near her ear. "The cameras are watching. Let them see the woman who holds their fortune." A sudden, high-pitched crack splintered the air. Before Imani could register the sound, the reinforced glass shattered into a billion diamond-like shards. The world tilted as Song-jin lunged, his massive frame colliding with hers, driving her into the shadow of a structural pillar. He shielded her body with his own, his weight a crushing, protective heat. The secondary impact of a bullet burying itself in the mahogany table where they had just sat echoed through the room. "Stay down," he hissed, his breath ragged. Imani scrambled back, her hands slick with something warm. It wasn't water. In the dim emergency lighting, she saw the dark stain spreading across the shoulder of his charcoal suit. The Ice King was leaking. "You're hit," she breathed, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. "It's a graze," he lied, though his jaw was clamped tight. He pulled a localized jammer from his pocket, killing the feed to the room's internal cameras. "My cousins. They aren't waiting for the board vote. They're purging the lineage tonight." The betrayal hung in the air, sharper than the smell of cordite. This wasn't an external threat, it was a fratricide. Song-jin slumped against the pillar, his face losing its bronze luster. He reached into a concealed cabinet in the pillar's base, pulling out a medical kit and a curved needle. His hands, usually so steady, had a microscopic tremor. "Do it," he ordered, shoving the kit toward her. "The bullet is through, but the artery is close. Stitch it, or I won't have the strength to carry you out of here." Imani's hands shook as she took the needle. She had spent 10 years viewing this man as an indestructible monster, a god of the underworld who moved lives like chess pieces. But as she peeled back his shirt, exposing the jagged, bleeding rent in his shoulder, the illusion shattered. His blood was the same hot, vivid crimson as her father's had been. Under her hands, his muscle flinched. He was mortal. He was breakable. As she drove the needle through his skin, his eyes locked onto hers, not with dominance, but with a raw, agonizing vulnerability. The power dynamic shifted in the silence of the darkened room. For the first time, the predator was at the mercy of the prey. She could kill him now, a slip of the needle, a puncture to the neck. "Finish it," he whispered, reading the dark intent in her eyes. She pulled the last stitch tight, her fingers trembling against his skin. She didn't kill him, but the debt was now his to carry. Before she could speak, the penthouse's heavy entry doors groaned. The sound of a thermal torch cutting through the locks filled the foyer. "We're out of time," Song-jin said, his voice a ghost of its former power. "They're inside." "And Imani? They aren't here for the ledger anymore. They're here to make sure no witnesses survive the night." The smell of burnt ozone from the thermal torch filled the hallway as Song-jin dragged Imani into the depths of his private study. He slammed the heavy oak door, the bolts clicking home just as the first boots thudded against the outer reinforced steel. He turned to her, his face pale from blood loss, his eyes burning with a desperate, frantic intensity. "The ledger, Imani. Give it to me," he demanded, his voice a jagged rasp. He gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging into the midnight silk. "My cousins are through the first perimeter. If they find you before I have those codes to leverage against the board, we are both dead men walking. Where did you hide it? Is it in a safety deposit? A grave?" Imani looked at the man who had haunted her dreams for a decade, the man who had just bled beneath her hands. She felt the weight of the secret she had carried since she was 12 years old, a weight heavier than the penthouse itself. "I buried it," she lied, her voice steady even as her heart thrashed. "In a place you'll never find without me. It's miles from here." Song-jin's grip tightened, his eyes searching hers for the telltale flicker of a fabrication. He leaned in close, his forehead almost touching hers. "Don't play games with me. Not now. I can see the lie in your throat. You want the truth? Imani hissed, pushing against his chest. She felt the dampness of his bandage against her palm. I burned it. 10 years ago, in a trash can behind a bus station. I watched the paper turn to ash and the ink curl into nothing. Song Jin recoiled as if she had struck him. You did what? That ledger was the only proof of the syndicate's treason. It was my only leverage. The paper is gone, Song Jin, she said, tapping her temple with a trembling finger. But the data isn't. I spent every night of my childhood memorizing those sequences. Every offshore account, every bribe, every ghost company. It's all in here. I am the ledger. The silence that followed was more violent than the gunshots echoing from the foyer. The shift in the room was tectonic. Imani was no longer just a ghost from his past or a girl to be protected, she was a living vault. She was the most valuable asset in the Goryeo Empire, and its greatest liability. Song Jin stared at her, a dark, complex realization dawning in his eyes. He couldn't kill her to keep the secret. He couldn't even let her out of his sight. If a single bullet found her brain, his entire legacy would vanish into the ether. He was no longer her master, he was her guardian by necessity, bound to her by the very information he had hunted her to obtain. You're a genius, he whispered, a terrifying mix of awe and fury in his voice. And a fool. You just made yourself the most hunted woman on the planet. The study door shuddered under a heavy blow. A voice from the other side, cold and mocking, shouted, Open up, Chairman. Let's see if the girl is worth the silk you wrapped her in. Song Jin looked at the door, then back at Imani. He reached for his weapon, but his eyes never left hers. If they take you, they'll carve your mind open. We have to move. Now. The grand ballroom of the Goryeo Plaza was a gilded cage of smoke and predatory smiles. Song Jin entered with his hand clamped firmly on the small of Imani's back, a possessive weight that signaled to every shark in the room, this is mine. To the syndicate, she was a trophy, a nameless pet, in a designer gown, brought to heel by the interim chairman. The whispers began the moment they crossed the threshold, venomous remarks about her race, her low-status background, and the delivery girl rumors already circulating like a virus through the elite. Keep your chin up, Song Jin murmured, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. Let them think you're a toy. It makes them careless. But Imani wasn't listening. Her gaze was locked on the far end of the ballroom, where a man in a white tuxedo stood surrounded by a circle of laughing sycophants. It was Deputy Director Park, the guest of honor, and the man who had pulled the trigger on her father while she hid in a kitchen cupboard 10 years ago. The air in her lungs turned to glass. As they approached the inner circle, a woman in diamonds let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Is this the new investment, Song Jin? She looks like she's more suited for the service entrance than the high table. The mockery was a physical assault, a wave of social humiliation designed to break her. Song Jin felt Imani's muscles tense under his palm. He expected her to crumble, to hide behind him, to play the part of the fragile captive. Instead, Imani stepped forward. She didn't look at the socialites, she looked directly into Park's eyes. Her stare was a cold, unwavering blade, stripped of fear and filled with a lethal intelligence that didn't belong on a pet. Park's smile faltered. He didn't recognize her yet, but he felt the predatory weight of her gaze. For a heartbeat, the power in the room shifted. The delivery girl vanished, replaced by a woman whose spine was forged from the very steel of the city she'd survived. A foreign sensation sparked in Song Jin's chest, a hot, jagged surge of protective rage. He had brought her here as bait, a piece on his chessboard, but seeing her endure their filth while standing taller than any of them made his blood boil. He realized with a jolt of terror that he no longer wanted her to be his shield. He wanted to be hers. Careful, Park, Song Jin interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a guillotine. She has a memory for faces. And a very long list of debts to collect. Park narrowed his eyes, the realization finally beginning to dawn. Song Jin, you're playing a dangerous game. Bringing a ghost to a gala is bad luck. Luck has nothing to do with it, Imani said, her voice a calm, deadly promise. Before Park could respond, the lights in the ballroom flickered and died. A heavy, rhythmic thudding began against the reinforced glass of the atrium. The bait had been taken, but as Songjin reached for his weapon, he felt Imani's hand close over his. She wasn't trembling. "The exit is to the left," she whispered, her voice a command. "And Park? He's not leaving tonight." The heavy titanium door of the gala's panic room sealed with a hydraulic thud, cutting off the screams and the staccato rhythm of gunfire from the atrium. Inside, the air was stale and tasted of recycled oxygen. The only light came from the dim red glow of the emergency terminal, casting Songjin's shadow long and jagged against the reinforced walls. He slumped against the console, his hand pressed to his reopened wound, his breathing a harsh, metallic rasp in the silence. "You knew," Imani said, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. She paced the small square of the room like a caged leopard, the silk of her gown rustling like a warning. "You knew Park would be there. You knew they would breach the facility. You've been orchestrating every second of this nightmare." Songjin looked up, his eyes glassy but focused. "I had to draw them out. The board, they needed to see that I was willing to sacrifice you to protect the asset. It's the only way they'll hesitate." "You used me," she hissed, stepping into the red light. "Just like you used me 10 years ago when you slaughtered my family and let me run into the dark." "I didn't let you run, Imani. I paved the road." The words stopped her cold. Songjin pushed himself upright, the effort carving lines of agony into his face. "The order that night was to leave no witnesses. Not even the girl in the cupboard. I was the one sent to finish the job. I stood over you with a suppressed barrel, and I saw a fire in your eyes that didn't belong in a grave." He stepped toward her, his presence no longer a threat, but a confession. "I shot the man behind me instead. I burned the house to cover your trail. Every apartment you rented, every job you lucked into, every bill that was mysteriously paid when you were short, that wasn't luck. That was me. I've been the shadow behind you for 3,000 nights because I couldn't live in a world where I'd put out your light." The revelation was a physical blow. The predator hadn't been hunting her, he had been her secret, silent architect. Her entire decade of independence was a gift from the man she hated most. The power she thought she'd clawed out of the dirt was just another layer of his control. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice breaking as he reached out a blood-stained hand toward her cheek. "I did it to keep you alive." Imani didn't cry. She didn't scream. She lunged. Her fist connected with his jaw with a sickening crack, the force of her rage sending him reeling back against the terminal. He didn't fight back, he took the blow, his head snapping to the side as a dark bruise began to bloom along his bone. "I don't want your protection," she spat, her knuckles throbbing. "And I don't give forgiveness." The terminal behind him suddenly shrieked. The red light turned to a flashing amber. A voice crackled through the comms, Park's voice. "The oxygen scrubbers have been remotely deactivated, Chairman. You have 20 minutes of air left. Tell the girl to start reciting the ledger, or you can both die in your golden tomb." The air in the panic room grew thin, each breath a shallow struggle against the encroaching vacuum. Songjin leaned against the console, the bruise she had given him darkening to a deep purple, a mark of her defiance. He watched her, not with anger, but with a terrifyingly patient expectation. 20 minutes, Imani, he rasped, the lack of oxygen thinning his voice. "The vault becomes a coffin. Give me the sequence for the first offshore account, or we suffocate together." Imani looked at the red fleck display, then back at the man who had secretly authored her life. The realization that she had been his project, his penance, burned hotter than the lack of air. She stepped toward him, the silk of her gown hissing against the floor. "I'll give you the billions," she whispered, her eyes hard as flint. "But not for my life. I want a trade. One life for the millions I'm about to put in your pocket." Songjin straightened, his gaze sharpening. "Who?" "Park," she said. "I want the man who pulled the trigger. I want him delivered to me. No bodyguards, no syndicate rules. I want him dead by my hand. A slow, dark smile ghosted across Songjin's lips. It wasn't the smile of a protector, it was the smile of a creator watching his masterpiece wake up. He reached into the hidden compartment of the console and pulled out a sleek, matte black suppressed pistol. He checked the chamber with a practiced flick before holding it out to her, grip first. I wondered when the girl in the cupboard would finally come out to play, he murmured. As Imani took the weapon, its weight felt heavy and honest in her hand. Songjin didn't let go of her immediately. He stepped behind her, his chest pressing against her back, his wounded shoulder a hot weight against her skin. He reached around, his large, tattooed hands enveloping hers on the grip. Don't just pull, he whispered in her ear, his breath a cold comfort. Squeeze. Feel the mechanism. You aren't just a delivery girl anymore, Imani. You are the weapon. The thrill that shot through her was dark and electric, a forbidden pulse of power. For 10 years, she had been a victim or a ghost. Now, with the predator guiding her aim, she felt a terrifying transformation. He wasn't just saving her, he was molding her into his own image, an assassin born from the ashes of his guilt. The first sequence, he prompted, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. 7 Alpha 90, she recited, her voice devoid of emotion. The terminal chirped as the first lock broke. The oxygen scrubbers groaned back to life, a rush of cold, sweet air filling the room. But as the door hissed open, a new warning flashed on the screen. Park wasn't fleeing, he was calling in the cleaners, a tactical unit that answered only to the syndicate's founding elders. You have your gun, Songjin said, his hand sliding from hers to her waist, pulling her flush against him. But if you miss, they won't just kill us. They'll erase us. The safe house hummed with the electric tension of a war room. Outside the reinforced glass, the cleaners were mobilizing, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of ink and antiseptic. Songjin sat on a low stool, his own bandaged shoulder stiff, his hands steady as he held a professional rotary tattoo machine. The silk gown had been pushed down, exposing the smooth expanse of Imani's left shoulder. This is not a decoration, he said, the needles hum a low, predatory snarl in the quiet room. This is the Goryeo seal. In our world, this ink is a digital key and a blood oath. It carries my biometric signature. With this on your skin, you have the authority to command my fleets and drain my vaults. You will be the only person in the syndicate who answers to no one but me. Imani felt the first sting of the needle piercing her skin. She didn't flinch. She watched his face, so focused and reverent, as he began to ink the intricate black dragon onto her flesh. The power shift was physical, a permanent branding that erased the delivery girl forever. He wasn't just claiming her body, he was giving her his crown. Why give me this much power, she whispered, the pain a grounding heat. I could destroy you with a single command. I'm counting on it, he murmured, his eyes meeting hers. I've spent 10 years holding you in the dark. Now, I'm putting you in the light where you can finally bite back. When the machine finally went silent, the skin was angry and red, but the mark was unmistakable. He wiped the excess ink away with a tenderness that felt like a betrayal of his nature. He stood and opened the heavy steel doors to the main hall, where his lieutenants, the same men who had mocked her at the gala, waited with crossed arms and scowls. Kneel, Songjin commanded, his voice a low thunder. The men hesitated, their eyes darting to Imani. One lieutenant, a man named Juan who had spit toward her feet an hour ago, stepped forward. Sir, she's a civilian. A courier. We don't bow to. Songjin didn't speak. He simply gripped Imani's shoulder and turned her, revealing the fresh, bleeding seal of the chairman. The silence that followed was absolute. One by one, the men dropped to one knee, their heads bowed in a display of forced, bitter submission. Imani stood tall, the transition from captive to consort crystallizing in the cold air of the safe house. She was no longer the bait, she was the master of the hounds. But the triumph was short-lived. A red light began to strobe on the tactical monitor. "Chairman," Juan said, his voice tight with newfound fear. "The mole just sent our coordinates. The cleaners aren't just coming, they've already breached the perimeter." Song Jin's hand tightened on Imani's arm. "They don't want the ledger anymore. They want the woman who can use it." The safe house lights flickered and died as the secondary generators failed, plunging the war room into a bruising crimson emergency glow. In the chaos of the breach, the line between ally and enemy dissolved. Song Jin was across the room, his back turned as he barked orders into a dead comms line, but Imani felt a presence behind her that didn't move with the frantic energy of the guards. It moved with the silence of a shadow. "Don't scream, Imani," a voice whispered. It was Juan, not the surly lieutenant who had hesitated to kneel, but Minho, the man who had stood at Song Jin's right hand for a decade. He was the only person Song Jin had ever spoken of with a semblance of warmth. Before she could turn, a cold blade pressed against the fresh, stinging ink of her new seal. "The elders offered me more than a seat at the table. They offered me the whole table. All I have to do is bring them the girl with the billions in her head." "Minho, what are you doing?" Song Jin turned, his face morphing from confusion to a jagged, soul-crushing realization. The betrayal was a physical blow. His only friend, the brother he had bled with in the trenches of the syndicate's rise, was holding a knife to the woman who now held his soul. "Step back, Jin," Minho snarled, his eyes wide with a desperate greed. "You've grown soft. You're trading an empire for a ghost. I'm doing you a favor. Once she's gone, you can be the monster they need again." Song Jin's hand went to his holster, but he was too slow. The grief in his eyes paralyzed him for a fraction of a second, a heartbeat of human weakness that was going to cost him everything. Minho shifted his grip, preparing to drag Imani toward the service exit, the blade knocking against her carotid artery. He didn't know she had practiced the draw 1,000 times in the silence of her own mind. Imani didn't wait for Song Jin to recover. She didn't wait for permission. She reached into the folds of her silk gown, her fingers finding the matte black grip of the suppressed pistol Song Jin had given her. In one fluid, violent motion, she dropped her weight, twisted, and jammed the barrel upward under Minho's jaw. Thwip. The sound was no louder than a dry branch snapping. Minho's eyes rolled back as he slumped to the floor, the light of greed extinguished in an instant. Song Jin stood frozen, his weapon half-drawn, staring at the body of his only friend. Then his gaze drifted to Imani. She stood over the corpse, the pistol steady in her hand, the red light reflecting in her eyes like a subterranean fire. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't seeking comfort. She was looking at him with the cold, hard clarity of a partner in blood. The shift was absolute. In a world of vipers and false brothers, the woman he had hunted, branded, and coerced was the only person on earth who had chosen his life over her own escape. "He's dead," she said, her voice a flat line. "And your father's men are in the lobby." Song Jin stepped over the body, his hand reaching out to cover hers on the gun. He didn't take it from her. He leaned his forehead against hers, his breath hitching. "He was the last one I trusted," he whispered. "Now there is only you." The elevator at the end of the hall chimed, a cheerful sound that heralded the arrival of a massacre. The heavy steel doors of the safe house didn't burst open, they were unlocked from the outside with a master code that only one man possessed. Elder Lee walked into the crimson-soaked room with the gait of a resurrected king, his prison-pale skin contrasting with the obsidian sharpness of his suit. Behind him, a phalanx of syndicate cleaners moved with robotic efficiency, stepping over Minho's corpse without a glance. "My son," the elder's voice was a dry rattle, cutting through the hum of the dying generators. "You've made a mess of my empire while I was behind bars. And all for a piece of refuse from the gutter." Song Jin stepped in front of Imani, his body a solid wall of defiance. "The refuse is the only person who can unlock the offshore accounts, father. She is the Goryeo treasury." The elder laughed, a sound devoid of mirth. "The treasury is useless if the bloodline is tainted. You think I don't recognize those eyes? I sent you to that house 10 years ago to erase a mistake your father-in-law made. I ordered the hit on her family because they were a cancer on our books. And you, in your weakness, let the cell survive. The world tilted on its axis for Imani. The predator standing before her hadn't been the architect of her trauma, he had been the failed executioner of a monster's whim. The true devil was the old man standing in the doorway, smiling at the memory of her family's blood. She has my seal on her skin, Songjin said, his voice dropping to a register that made the cleaners shift their weight. She is the syndicate now. You are just a ghost from a cage. Then you are a traitor to your blood, the elder hissed. He raised a hand, and a dozen red laser dots bloomed across Songjin's chest and Imani's throat. Kill the girl. We will find another way to the money. A chairman who loves his asset more than his legacy is no chairman at all. The tension in the room snapped like a high-tension wire. Songjin didn't look back at the gunman. He looked at Imani, a silent, devastating communication passing between them. He reached back, his hand finding hers, his fingers interlacing with a grip that promised either victory or a shared grave. I am not my father, Songjin whispered, loud enough for the room to hear. He raised his weapon, but he didn't point it at the cleaners. He pointed it at the elder. And I am no longer your son. In that heartbeat, the Mafia boss died, and a traitor was born. He had traded 10 generations of lineage for a girl with a delivery backpack and a scar he'd spent a decade trying to heal. Open fire, the elder commanded. Songjin tackled Imani toward the heavy mahogany desk as the room exploded into a hail of lead. As they hit the floor, he shielded her with his entire frame, his breath hot against her ear. The car in the sublevel is armored. If I don't make it to the driver's seat, you drive. You don't stop for anything. The tires of the armored sedan shrieked against the asphalt as they cleared the city limits, the skyline of Seoul fading into a jagged silhouette of betrayal behind them. By the time they reached the foothills of the Taebaek Mountains, the car was a smoking wreck, peppered with bullet holes and leaking fluids. The syndicate's reach had been cut off by the sheer verticality of the terrain, but the cost was absolute. Every digital account tied to Songjin's name had been frozen. His titles were stripped, his name was a death warrant. He stumbled out of the driver's side, his movements heavy and uncoordinated. Without the bespoke suit and the shadow of his lieutenants, he looked smaller, raw, a man bleeding out under a canopy of ancient pines. We have to move, Imani said, her voice cutting through the mountain mist. She had already shed the remnants of the silk gown, having found a tactical jumpsuit and boots in the trunk. She looked at the steep, vine-choked incline. This wasn't a boardroom or a ballroom. This was the wild, the same kind of unforgiving terrain she had navigated as a runaway teen sleeping in construction sites and back alleys. Songjin looked at the brush, then at his trembling hands. The interim chairman didn't know how to survive a world that didn't bow to him. The fortress is 5 miles up. We'll never make it on foot before dawn. You won't, Imani corrected, grabbing his uninjured arm and throwing it over her shoulder. But I will. Follow my lead and step where I step. The power shift was total. In the city, he was the architect of her reality. Here, in the damp, biting cold of the mountains, he was a liability. She led him through the dense undergrowth, her eyes alert to the snap of a twig or the shimmer of a tripwire. She moved with a feral grace, her years of dodging transit police and predatory street gangs manifesting as a sharp, survivalist instinct. As they climbed, the status that had defined them fell away like dead skin. There was no boss and captive, no king and consort. There was only the heat of their bodies clashing in the cold, the desperate rhythm of their shared breathing, and the electricity of his skin against hers as she pulled him through a ravine. When they finally reached a shallow cave to catch their breath, the silence was deafening. Songjin leaned against the damp stone, his eyes fixed on her. The dominance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked attraction that made the air between them feel charged. He wasn't looking at the ledger in her head, he was looking at the woman who had dragged him out of the grave. I have nothing left to give you, Imani, he rasped, his hand reaching out to touch the tactical fabric over her hip. No titles. No empire. Just the man who failed to kill you. Good, she whispered, leaning into his space until their lips were a hair's breadth apart. I never liked the chairman anyway. A low, mechanical hum vibrated through the ground, the sound of a drone's rotors. The elder hadn't given up. He was hunting them with heat signatures, and they were trapped on an open ledge. The mountain air turned into a wheezing lungful of ice as the drones circled closer, their red lenses scanning the treeline like the eyes of mechanical vultures. Inside the cramped, derelict stone hut that served as their final refuge, the silence was a heavy shroud. They were down to a single clip of ammunition and a half-liter of gray water. Song Jin sat against the rotting wood of the doorframe, his face a mask of pale resolve. The thermal sweep will hit this sector in 10 minutes, he said, his voice devoid of its usual velvet edge. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a small, weighted object wrapped in oilcloth. He pressed it into Imani's palm. It was a set of keys to a reinforced SUV hidden in a drainage tunnel 2 miles downslope, and a passport. Not a forgery, a legitimate, high-level diplomatic document issued in a name she didn't recognize. There's a flight waiting in Incheon, he whispered. The pilot is paid. The destination is a shore where the Goryeo name is a ghost. You'll have enough in the first memorized account to buy a new life. A real one. Imani stared at the blue booklet, the weight of it feeling like a betrayal. And you? I'm the distraction. He stood up, his movements stiff but purposeful. He checked his weapon, knowing it was nearly empty. They want the chairman. I'll give them a chase they won't forget. While they're focused on the traitor in the brush, you disappear into the shadows you know so well. You're going to die, she said, the words catching in her throat. Song Jin stepped close, his hand cupping the back of her neck. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers, a gesture that felt more like a prayer than a goodbye. I've been dead since the night I let you run, Imani. This is just the world catching up to the fact. He didn't wait for her to argue. He vanished into the mist, the sound of his heavy boots crunching on the frost-covered needles as he intentionally moved toward the light of a hovering search drone. A moment later, the forest erupted. Gunshots rang out, a deliberate, rhythmic baiting, followed by the aggressive roar of syndicate engines moving away from the hut, chasing the ghost of a king. Imani stood in the center of the hut, the passport clutched in her hand. For 10 years, this was the dream, a ticket out, a clean slate, and the end of the man who haunted her. But as she looked at the door, the cold realization shattered her. The freedom he had bought with his life felt like a hollow, plastic thing. She didn't want a life built on his corpse. She didn't want to run from the predator, she wanted to stand beside the man. The drone's hum faded, replaced by the distant, chilling sound of a struggle and a heavy impact. She dropped the passport into the dirt. She didn't need a new name. She reached for the ceramic knife and the spare magazine he'd left behind. If he thought he was the only one capable of a sacrifice, he was about to learn just how much of a monster he had actually created. Song Jin was on his knees in the mud, the silver light of a tactical spotlight pinning him against the jagged mountain rock. His hands were zip-tied behind his back, his face a map of lacerations and dark, wet crimson. 2 syndicate cleaners held rifles to his skull while his father's voice crackled through a handheld radio, savoring the execution. Song Jin closed his eyes, waiting for the finality of a bullet, content that Imani was miles away, crossing a border he had opened for her. The forest didn't explode with a gunshot. It exploded with the percussive thud of 3 blacked-out transport helicopters dropping from the clouds. Rappelling lines whipped through the air like striking cobras. A dozen specialized mercenaries in slate-gray tactical gear hit the ground with professional silence, their suppressors sneezing as they eliminated the cleaners before the men could even register the breach. In the center of the formation, Imani stepped out of the mist. She wasn't wearing the tactical jumpsuit anymore, she wore a high-collared trench coat, her silhouette sharp and commanding against the chaotic glare of the spotlight. "Wait," Song Jin wheezed, his eyes widening as he looked up at her. "The passport, the car, you were supposed to be gone." Imani knelt in front of him, the ceramic knife she'd kept now slicing through his restraints with a single, practiced flick. She didn't look like a girl who had been rescued. She looked like the architect of the massacre. The passport was a nice gesture, Song-jin, but I've had my own exit strategy since chapter 5, she whispered, her voice a cold, terrifyingly calm velvet. I didn't memorize those codes just to buy a quiet life. I used the third offshore account, the one your father thinks is a ghost, to put a $10 million retainer on the Blackwood Group. You didn't give me the resources to escape. You gave me the resources to take over. Song-jin stared at her, the shock of her betrayal of his expectations hitting harder than the physical blows he'd endured. He realized then that he hadn't been protecting a victim, he had been harboring a genius-level strategist who had played him from the moment she walked through his door. She had used his guilt, his protection, and his very name to consolidate the power she needed to burn the syndicate to the ground. You played me, he breathed, a raw, jagged or replacing the pain in his voice. I leveled the field, she corrected, standing and signaling for her lead mercenary to hand her a tablet. The screen displayed the syndicate's internal security hub, now glowing green. You're the sword, Song-jin. But I'm the mind. And right now, the mind wants the chairman's head. She offered him her hand. It wasn't a gesture of a captive seeking comfort, but of a queen inviting her general to the front lines. The power imbalance was dead. As he took her hand, he realized he didn't just love her, he feared her. The helicopters are refueled, she said, looking toward the city. The board is meeting at dawn to confirm your father. Let's go show them what a real coup looks like. The glass atrium of the Goryeo Tower shattered inward as the first wave of Blackwood mercenaries breached the upper tier, but it was Imani and Song-jin who stepped through the smoke. They moved in a lethal, synchronized rhythm, the outcast king and the delivery girl who had rewritten her own destiny. The lobby, once a cathedral of syndicate power, became a kill zone. Song-jin moved with a renewed, savage grace, his charcoal suit stained with mountain dirt and fresh blood, clearing the path with a suppressed rifle while Imani tapped commands into a handheld deck. The server room is isolated, she said, her voice cutting through the roar of a flashbang. They've locked the physical drives. They're terrified, Song-jin replied, stepping over a fallen guard. He glanced at her, his eyes burning with a dark, secondary heat. They finally realized who is really knocking at the door. They reached the inner sanctum, a vault of obsidian glass where the syndicate's elders sat frozen in the flicker of emergency lights. Imani didn't go for the money. She didn't trigger the offshore transfers. She jammed her deck into the primary port and began the final decryption of the ledger's deepest layers, the data she had kept even from Song-jin. As the files unspooled across the massive monitors, the air in the room went cold. This wasn't a ledger of bribes and drug routes. It was a blueprint. The syndicate wasn't just a criminal empire, it was a shell company for the Elysium Project, a massive, state-level conspiracy designed to privatize the country's entire infrastructure. The elders weren't just gangsters, they were the puppet masters of the nation's survival, holding the keys to the grid, the water, and the very laws that governed the people. We aren't just taking a gang, Song-jin, Imani whispered, the blue light of the data reflecting in her eyes like a digital sea. We're taking the country back from the men who stole it. The realization hit Song-jin with the force of a physical blow. He had spent his life thinking he was part of a powerful family, he was merely a guard dog for a corporate shadow state. He looked at the elders, men he had once feared, and saw only parasites. Burn it, he commanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl. Burn the old world down, Imani. With a single keystroke, she didn't just steal the money, she leaked the proof of Elysium to every major news outlet and international court on the planet. The Goryeo name was being dismantled in real time, its secrets hemorrhaging into the public eye. The cinematic high of their vengeance was a roar of data and fire, two ghosts from the cupboard finally setting the house ablaze. But as the elders scrambled, the elder himself stepped from the shadows behind the server racks. He wasn't holding a gun, he was holding a remote detonator. If the lineage ends, the tower ends with it, the old man hissed, his face twisted in a mask of genocidal pride. Choose, Song-jin. The girl, or the chair. The server room was a graveyard of digital secrets, the air humming with the high-pitched whine of overtaxed cooling fans. Elder Lee stood amidst the wreckage, the detonator in his left hand and a ceremonial, silver-etched pistol in his right. He didn't look like a defeated man, he looked like a priest of a dying religion, ready to perform one last sacrifice. The data is out, but the seed is still warm, Song Jin, the elder rasped, his eyes darting between his son and the woman who had dismantled his life's work. He tossed the silver pistol onto the floor between them. It skidded across the glass, stopping at Song Jin's boots. The board is dead. The Elysium project is exposed. But the syndicate can survive in the shadows if the bloodline remains pure. Pick up the gun. Execute the girl who stole our silence, and I will hand you the chairmanship. You will be the man who saved the Goryeo from the brink. Imani stood perfectly still, her hand still resting on the deck that had just set the world on fire. She didn't reach for her own weapon. She looked at Song Jin, the man who had been her hunter, her protector, and finally, her partner. The power imbalance that had defined their lives for 10 years narrowed down to the weight of that silver pistol. Song Jin looked at the gun, then at the father who had ordered the slaughter of an innocent family to protect a ledger. For a heartbeat, the ghost of the man he was meant to be, the cold, dutiful heir, flickered in his eyes. One shot, Song Jin, the elder urged, a desperate greed leaking into his voice. And we rebuild everything. Song Jin reached down and gripped the pistol. The metal was cold, a familiar weight of 1,000 previous sins. He straightened, the barrel leveled at Imani's chest. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum that felt like it might collapse the building before the detonator ever could. I spent my life trying to be the son you wanted, Song Jin said, his voice a jagged, terrifyingly calm whisper. I broke my soul to fit into your chair. Then, in a motion so fluid it seemed born of a sudden, violent enlightenment, he pivoted. The barrel of the silver pistol didn't find Imani, it found the space between his father's eyes. But I'd rather be a traitor to a monster than a king in a world without her. The elder's face contorted, his thumb hovering over the detonator. You would destroy 10 generations of blood for a career. I'm not destroying the bloodline, father, Song Jin said, his finger tightening on the trigger. I'm ending the infection. The shot echoed through the vault, a final, thunderous punctuation mark to the Lee dynasty. The elder slumped back, the detonator slipping from his lifeless fingers as he fell into the abyss of his own greed. Song Jin dropped the pistol. He didn't look at the body. He turned to Imani, his face stripped of every mask he had ever worn. He was no longer a boss or a predator, he was a man who had burned his own throne to keep her safe. It's over, she whispered, her voice finally breaking. No, he said, taking her hand as the building's emergency sirens began to wail. It's just beginning. But we have to move. The tower is still rigged to blow. The subterranean council chamber was a cathedral of shadow and cold light, rebuilt in the wake of the tower's destruction. The surviving elders of the Goryeo sat in high-backed chairs of carved obsidian, their faces masks of strained neutrality. They had watched the world burn on the news, they had seen the Elysium project dismantled by the very woman who now stood at the center of the room. The air was thick with the scent of incense and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. A velvet-lined box sat on the central dais, holding the Goryeo ring, a heavy band of platinum and blood-red jade that had dictated the fate of the underworld for a century. Traditionally, the ring was kissed by the subordinates as the new chairman took his seat. Song Jin stepped forward, the charcoal wool of his suit crisp, his movements radiating the quiet, absolute authority of a man who had killed his own past to survive his future. He reached into the box. The elders leaned in, waiting for the moment of formal succession. But Song Jin didn't slide the ring onto his own finger. He turned to Imani. The room went deathly silent. Imani stood tall, her hair braided with silver wire, her shoulder bearing the dark, healed ink of the Goryeo seal. She was no longer the girl in the thermal jacket, she was the architect of their new reality. Song Jin took her hand, the same hand he had once pinned against a wall in a dark foyer, and slid the jade ring onto her finger. The Goryeo does not have a king, Songjin's voice boomed, echoing off the obsidian walls. It has a mind and a sword. From this moment, Imani is co-chairman. Her word is my breath. Her command is your law. You will bow to her as you bow to the legacy itself. The power imbalance didn't just shift, it evaporated. They stood as twin pillars, a black woman from the streets of the city and the man who had traded his soul to keep her there. The elders hesitated, the weight of 100 years of tradition pressing against their throats. Then, one by one, they stood and bowed, not to Songjin, but to the woman whose brilliance had outplayed them all. The delivery girl was a ghost, buried under the rubble of the old tower. The Mafia queen was born in the silence of their submission. We are not the syndicate anymore, Imani said, her voice a calm, lethal promise as she looked at the bowed heads. We are the new order. And the first order is an audit of your lives. The triumph was a jagged glass high. But as the elders retreated, a young initiate rushed into the chamber, his face white with terror. He whispered into Songjin's ear, and the color drained from the new chairman's face. He looked at Imani, his grip on her hand tightening until it hurt. What is it? She asked, the ring cold against her skin. The wedding wine, he whispered. The loyalists, they didn't flee. They left a gift for the coronation. The traditional wedding ceremony was a sea of white lilies and hidden blades. In the private inner sanctum of the Goryeo estate, away from the prying eyes of the new board, a single crystal chalice sat upon a pedestal. It was the union of breath, a ritual where the co-chairs drank from the same vintage to seal their shared reign. The liquid inside was a deep, translucent amber, catching the light of the setting sun. Imani reached for the glass, her fingers grazing the cool crystal, but Songjin's hand intercepted hers. His grip was firm, his eyes locked on a microscopic residue of white film clinging to the rim, a calling card of the elders' remaining shadow loyalists. Wait, he whispered. He didn't call for the guards. He didn't shatter the glass. Instead, he looked at Imani with an intensity that bordered on the holy. He knew the toxin, it was a neuroinhibitor, a slow-acting paralysis that would turn the victim into a living statue before stopping the heart. He also knew that only one dose of the rare, synthetic antidote existed in his private safe, a precaution he'd taken since his youth. They want to see if the queen can be toppled, Songjin said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. If you fall, the syndicate fractures again. But if I fall, you are the sole head. You will have the sympathy of the ranks and the power of the ledger. Before she could protest, he raised the chalice. In a single, defiant motion, he drained the amber liquid. Songjin, no. The glass shattered against the floor. Almost instantly, the effects took hold. His pupils blown wide, Songjin's knees buckled. Imani caught him, his massive frame dragging them both to the floor amidst the lilies. His skin turned a sickly, translucent gray, and his breathing became a wet, shallow struggle. The safe, he managed to choke out, his hand clutching her arm with fading strength. The code, is the date, you ran. The power shift was absolute and terrifying. He had intentionally placed his life in her hands, stripping away the last vestige of his dominance to prove a point that blood couldn't. He was hers, body and soul. Imani scrambled for the hidden wall panel, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She found the vial, a neon blue serum, and a needle. She knelt over him, her hands trembling as she pressed the needle to his neck. For a heartbeat, she stared at the man who had haunted her, protected her, and finally, died for her. She could wait 10 seconds. If she waited, the empire was hers alone. No partner, no shadow, no debt. But the thought was a cold poison of its own. She slammed the plunger down. Songjin's body convulsed, a ragged, agonized gasp tearing from his lungs as the antidote fought the toxin. He looked up at her, his eyes clearing, the life returning to his face. He reached up, his hand mapping the line of her jaw with a proprietary, broken reverence. My life, is yours, he whispered. Literally. I have nothing left that isn't yours. The door to the sanctum burst open. Juan stood there, his face ashen. The loyalists have moved. They aren't just targeting the leadership. They've leaked the coordinates of your father's original grave. They're digging up the past, Imani. They found the names of the men who actually pulled the trigger. The warehouse on the edge of the Incheon docks smelled of stagnant salt and old grease. Inside, 3 men were zip-tied to rusted chairs, their faces a frantic map of sweat and terror. These weren't high-ranking elders or tactical geniuses, they were the retired muscle, the cleaners, who had followed Elder Lee's orders 10 years ago to erase a family in a basement apartment. Song Jin stood in the shadows, his presence a silent, suffocating weight. He didn't intervene. He didn't offer advice. He simply stood as the perimeter, a wall of tattooed muscle and expensive wool, ensuring the world outside stayed away while Imani finished what began in the dark. Imani stepped into the harsh circle of a single overhead bulb. She still wore the jade Goryo ring, but the suppressed pistol in her hand felt more natural. She looked at the man in the center chair, the one with the jagged scar across his nose. He had been the one to kick in the kitchen door. "I remember your boots," she said, her voice a flat, terrifyingly calm line. "I remember the way they sounded on the linoleum while I hid in the cupboard." "It was just a job, lady," the man shrieked, his chair rattling against the concrete. "We were told they were rats. We didn't know about the kid." "I know you didn't," Imani whispered. "That's why you're still breathing. For now." She didn't hesitate. The justice she meted out wasn't a spectacle, it was a surgical removal of the cancer that had eaten her youth. 3 muffled cracks echoed through the hollow space. As the last body slumped forward, the heavy, vibrating rage that had fueled Imani for 3,000 days didn't explode, it simply evaporated. The fire went out, leaving behind nothing but the cold, quiet ash of the truth. She wasn't a victim anymore, but she wasn't a ghost either. The gun slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the floor. The sound seemed to break the spell. Imani's shoulders, which had been held with the rigidity of a soldier for a decade, finally buckled. She didn't fall to her knees, she fell into Song Jin. He caught her instantly, his arms wrapping around her with a fierce, protective gravity. He didn't speak. He didn't tell her it was for the best. He simply held her as the first sob tore through her, not for the woman she had become, but for the little girl in the plain jacket who had lost her world at the wrong door. She cried for the years spent running, for the hunger, and for the father whose face was fading in her memory. "It's over, Imani," he murmured into her hair, his breath the only warm thing in the room. "The debt is paid." But as they walked toward the exit, his phone vibrated, a high-priority alert from the central bank. The ledger data she had leaked was causing a global market collapse, and the syndicate's remaining assets were being seized by an international task force. "The purge worked too well," Song Jin said, his eyes hardening. "We've destroyed the old world, but the new one is coming for our heads." The glass walls of the new Goryo Heights did not overlook a city of shadows, but a sprawling hub of legitimate global trade. From the top floor, Imani watched the digital ticker of the newly formed Goryo Foundation, a multinational conglomerate that had swallowed the syndicate's black market roots and repurposed them into infrastructure, tech, and logistics. The transition had been bloodless but absolute. "The final filings are complete," Song Jin said, his voice a low vibration behind her. He stepped into the light, no longer the looming predator of the penthouse foyer, but a man who had found a different kind of power in submission. He handed her a single tablet. Imani scrolled through the documents, her breath hitching as she realized the scale of what he'd done. Every holding, every offshore account she had once memorized, and every shell company they had salvaged from the Elysium wreck was now registered under one name, Imani Jallo. "You've transferred everything," she whispered, turning to face him. "The real estate, the fleets, the patents. I own it all." "I am the chairman of a ghost," Song Jin replied, a faint, proud smile touching his lips. "You are the Goryo. Without you, the money is just numbers on a screen. With you, it's an empire." The dominance to devotion arc was a closed circle. He had begun as the man who held her life in his hands, now, he was the man who had placed his entire legacy, his safety, and his name at her feet. He was the sword, the one who dealt with the lingering threats and the tactical maneuvers, but she was the mind, the undisputed architect of their future. The power imbalance hadn't just been erased, it had been inverted and stabilized by a fierce, mutual respect. "I could fire you," she joked, though her eyes were soft. "I'm unfireable," he murmured, closing the distance between them. He didn't tower over her to intimidate, he leaned in to share her space, his forehead resting against hers. "I'm your shadow, remember? You can't get rid of a shadow unless you step into the dark." The intimacy was no longer a weapon, it was their sanctuary. But the peace was interrupted by a low-frequency hum from the security console. A live feed flickered onto the wall, a sleek, unmarked delivery drone was hovering outside the reinforced balcony, carrying a small, vintage-wrapped package. "I didn't order anything," Imani said, her instincts flaring. Song Jin's eyes darkened as he looked at the drone. "Neither did I. But the biometric signature on the sender's tag, it's a match for someone we thought died in the tower collapse." The screen zoomed in on the package. Tucked into the twine was a single, charred playing card, the King of Hearts, with a bullet hole through the center. The message was clear, the old world wasn't quite finished burning, and the new order was already being measured for its coffin. The penthouse smelled exactly as it had that first night, sandalwood, gun oil, and the sharp, clinical scent of power. But as Imani stepped onto the marble foyer, the weight of the silver-etched pistol at her hip felt more natural than the thermal bag she had carried a lifetime ago. The city lights of Seoul pulsed outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, no longer a predatory maze, but a kingdom they had rebuilt from the ashes. Song Jin stood by the balcony, his back to her. He had shed his suit jacket, his white shirt rolled up to reveal the ink of the dragons that had once terrified her. He looked at the heavy oak door, the wrong door that had started it all. "You never asked how a billionaire's son ended up on a random delivery route," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "I assumed you finally got a hit on my location and rigged the app," Imani replied, walking toward him. Song Jin turned, and the look in his eyes wasn't one of a strategist, but of a man laying down his last weapon. "I didn't rig the app, Imani. I bought the company. I bought the entire delivery franchise the morning I saw your name on a background check for a courier job. I sat in this room for 6 hours, watching your GPS dot crawl across the map, waiting for you to knock." Imani froze. The scale of his obsession was a new kind of vertigo. "You bought a national corporation just to get a package delivered?" "I bought it to ensure no one else could touch you," he confessed, stepping into her space. He reached out, his thumb tracing the jade ring on her finger. "For 10 years, I watched you from the shadows, a ghost protecting a girl who didn't want to be found. But the dark was swallowing me. You weren't a target, Imani. You were the only light I had left. I didn't hunt you for the money. I hunted you because I was drowning, and you were the only thing worth saving." The finality of it hit her with the force of an embrace. The wrong door hadn't been a mistake, it was the only door in the world that led her back to herself. The power imbalance was gone, replaced by a devotion so absolute it was terrifying. He stood behind her now, his tattooed hands resting on her waist as they looked out at their empire. He wasn't a barrier anymore, he was her foundation. "The board is waiting for our first directive," she whispered, leaning back into his heat. "Let them wait," Song Jin murmured against her hair. "We have an eternity. And this time, no one is knocking." The Ice King had melted, not into a good man, but into a man who would burn the world to keep her warm. While the journey of Imani and Song Jin is an intense exploration of the dark romance genre, it serves as a powerful narrative vehicle for several profound educational and psychological themes. Beyond the high-stakes world of the Goryeo Syndicate, the story delves into the complexities of human resilience, the ethics of power, and the transformative nature of agency. The psychology of resilience and trauma. At its core, the story provides an illustration of complex trauma and survival. Imani's character arc, moving from a hypervigilant delivery girl to a strategic powerhouse, mirrors the real-world psychological concept of post-traumatic growth. Her ability to memorize the ledger as a child was a survival mechanism that she eventually converted into a tool for liberation. This highlights a key educational takeaway: the skills forged in the fires of adversity can be repurposed to reclaim one's destiny. Power dynamics and social agency. The narrative offers a stark critique of institutional power. By revealing the Elysium Project, the story moves beyond simple Mafia tropes to discuss how systemic corruption can mirror legitimate corporate structures. Imani's rise as a black woman to the head of a traditionalist Korean organization serves as a subversive commentary on breaking glass ceilings and the intersectionality of power. It teaches that true authority is not merely inherited but earned through strategic brilliance and moral fortitude. The ethics of devotion. The transition from dominance to devotion in Song Jin's arc provides an educational look at the deconstruction of toxic masculinity. His redemption is not found in becoming a good man by societal standards, but in the total relinquishing of his ego. By transferring his assets to Imani and positioning himself as her sword, he demonstrates a shift from power over to power with. This explores the philosophical idea that true strength lies in the vulnerability required to trust another completely. Narrative strategy and literacy. For aspiring writers, the story serves as a masterclass in cinematic pacing and structural tension. The use of the wrong door as a bookend creates a narrative symmetry that emphasizes the theme of fate versus choice. The educational value here lies in understanding how to maintain a central tension, the ledger, while allowing character growth, the romance, to evolve naturally alongside the plot. Ultimately, this story teaches that while we cannot always choose which doors we knock on, we have the absolute power to decide how we walk through them.